Now, the UN Special Envoy for Afghanistan says the country is heading towards a catastrophe, calling on the Taliban to cease their attacks on major cities immediately.
In the past weeks, the war in Afghanistan has entered a new, deadlier, and more destructive phase. The Taliban campaign during June and July to capture rural areas has achieved significant territorial gains. From this strengthened position, they have begun to attack the larger cities.
While briefing the UN Security Council, Aoun said more than 1,000 Afghan civilians have been killed in the past month. She also questioned the Taliban's commitment to a political settlement, saying that the militants know that further bloodshed will only complicate the reconciliation process. Aoun urged the Security Council to press the warring sides, that is, to stop fighting and to join the negotiating table. This comes after the Taliban took control of Zaranj in Nimruz province. This is the first provincial capital to fall to the militants who have been fighting government forces in several big cities. Now, to discuss that further, we're joined by Mr. Brian Downing, a military analyst out of Florida, and also Tony Gosling, investigative journalist out of Bristol. Thank you very much to both of you, gentlemen. Let's begin with Mr. Downing. Now, the UN official very correctly pointed out to the fact that if a certain party is willing to negotiate, it should not be looking for bloodshed. What is your take on that?
Well, I do believe that the Taliban will go for a political solution. As victorious and unstoppable as they look now, I think they realized that back in the 90s, they were never able to govern the entire country. They always had a great deal of resistance from Tajik, Hazara, Turkmen, and Uzbek people in the north, and they were supported by foreign powers, including, they being those ethnic groups, were supported by foreign powers, including Iran. So I think that the Taliban don't or should not have high hopes of taking the whole country for fear of irritating regional powers, not only Iran, but also China and also Russia. They don't want the Taliban to control the whole country, and they are going to use their influence with the Taliban and with Pakistan, which has a great deal of control over the Taliban, to accept a political settlement. Right now, what's going on, these battles in the south, the Taliban are trying to increase their bargaining position in those areas. Remember, Kandahar was the Taliban capital in the 90s. They very much want it back, and it's probably within grasp for them.
Mr. Gosling, well, we just heard what Mr. Downing said, his analysis of the situation there, but it does not seem that way. The Taliban seem to be moving forward to take control of the entire country. That's what it appears from outside, at least.
Well, for the time being, it might do, but I would actually agree with the wise words of Mr. Downing there in Florida, that they're actually, I think, making a military point, which is going to be in the future, goodness knows how long, within the next few weeks and months, maybe even days, is going to be their bargaining position when they come to the table to talk. And I think they will talk. Of course, they have been talking. And in fact, that's one of the reasons we're told that the United States, Britain and NATO troops have now left Afghanistan. But I mean, I think it's a bit rich of the United Nations official to talk about it descending into, I think, was it chaos, she said, or a catastrophe? I mean, the real catastrophe, of course, has been the last 20 years, massive occupation of their country by NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that is supposed to be based between Britain and America and Europe in the Atlantic Ocean, which is, you know, many thousands of miles away. That's the real catastrophe. And of course, the reason why they're there has nothing to do with hunting for bin Laden, as the Western media told us back in 2001. looking for him in a cave in Afghanistan. It's all to do with geopolitics. It's an important strategic region, next to Russia, close to China as well. I mean, if you look at the actual routes between Russia and China, there is Afghanistan sitting there. It's an important strategic place, and I'm afraid the locals have just been used as pawns. I think what we're looking at now, though, is the same sort of situations we've seen in so many of these countries where NATO and the Western powers have been interfering. In other words, putting in puppet Western governments and then complaining when that Western government starts to collapse and the actual indigenous people. Let's not forget, for example, that the Taliban virtually halted the massive opium crops that were being grown by Western interests in Afghanistan in the run-up to the invasion in 2001. So, it would be really nice, wouldn't it, if people could stop interfering in the country and let the local people carry on with their own affairs. But that doesn't seem likely, as we were hearing. Also, I think one of the things I've heard is the Americans are pulling out. They've pulled out. No, there's still US airstrikes going on there. And the Americans, it seems, almost want to use up their bombs and ammunition in still carrying on and interfering because, they're basically cowards. They'd much rather bomb from the air than actually have troops on the ground. And this is one of the reasons why the population in Afghanistan is so vehemently anti-American, particularly, and British, anti-NATO, anti these countries, is because of the hideous bombing campaign, the drone bombing campaign that's been going on. They certainly haven't won any hearts and minds, have they, by killing people at funerals and weddings and things like that. The local population just think America is like the devil and want them to leave, and they're very glad they're going. But of course, there is, this conflict that's going on now. I think in a short period of time we will see the Taliban at the negotiating table.
Thank you very much. Now back to Mr. Downing. So you believe that the Taliban will eventually go to the negotiating table. What about the large number of civilian casualties here? Isn't that something that would affect the negotiations?
Perhaps to some extent, but I think a lot of these civilians are fleeing into Iran, and I think that would just give Iran more impetus to prevail on regional powers they're in alliance with to press the Taliban into negotiations to get this war over with. I think there are already hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of Afghan refugees in Iran. Many of them are trying to exit west into Europe. But yeah, the civilian refugee problem will be immense. Even if the Taliban do settle, I think there are going to be a lot of people who live in those Taliban-dominated areas who, they just don't want to live that way. They're going to try to get out, which of course will lead to the Taliban trying to keep them from going out. So I think even if there's a settlement, there are going to be a lot of tensions, and the refugee problem, the human rights problem will be one problem. Another would be, people are going to try to get the Taliban to wipe out Al-Qaeda and ISIL. They have some pockets in there. China doesn't want those groups there. China has troops in eastern Afghanistan trying to prevent exfiltration from Afghanistan into China's Xinjiang province. So there's a lot of trouble coming, and I hope there's a settlement, and I hope it works well, but there are tensions within that settlement that will have to come through.
So, Mr. Downing, when do you presume those negotiations will begin?
I think if the Taliban took Kandahar and maybe Herat and Lashkar Gah, I think you would see the Kabul government's position in the south and the east just collapse, and they'd give up any hope of controlling the country. So the fall of 2 or 3 of those cities, I think, would be the signal to Kabul and to the Taliban. Let's get this thing over with. Should have been done years ago, but the fall of 2 or 3 of those cities, I think, will do it.
Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Gosling, this is the final question. Yes, please go ahead. We have less than 1 minute.
Okay, I'll be really quick. Look, one of the questions that not enough people are asking is why have the NATO forces decided to leave now? This is a key question, because I think if we look at the new Defence Minister Benny Gantz in Israel, there is a really upping of the ante when it comes to. We've also seen yesterday all these airstrikes on Lebanon, the biggest since 2006. The Israelis do seem, and they're making these statements now about wanting to have actually start a war with Iran. And it would make sense to me, if this is something that's in the pipeline, being covertly, secretly planned and talked about amongst the Anglo-Zionist empire, that may well be why these troops are coming back to the US and coming back to Britain, is because the military leaders are very much believe that there may be about to be a first strike by the Israelis, and of course they will be trying to do all they can in the world's press to convince everybody that it's Iran's fault, even though it's a war that they are instigating from Tel Aviv.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist out of Bristol, and Mr. Brian Downing, military analyst out of Florida. Thanks to both of you gentlemen for your comments on this edition of the News Review, and thanks to all of our viewers for following.